Disclaimer: the 5 elements are earth, water, air, fire, and J.K. Rowling. Hermione got ready for her first day at Hogwarts for her 6th year. She had already met with Professor Slughorn and Remus at Grimmauld Place for her other lessons, except runes, which she'd start at the Burrow in a few weeks when she could apparate freely. But this was her first class at the castle. Alchemy, to be precise. Professor McGonagall had sent her a letter telling her the class schedule, which had necessitated some minor changes to her plans. Alchemy was a late afternoon class sandwiched in between 6th year Transfiguration and supper on Wednesdays and Fridays. She considered taking Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration class as well, but she decided against it. She didn't want to run afoul of any rules that would make her a full-time Hogwarts student. One of the Weasleys, or an Order member, would need to apparate her to and from the school, so to save them the trouble, her parents agreed to let her stay at the castle overnight on Friday nights since she had her independent studies on Saturday mornings. She also had the option of eating supper with her friends on Wednesdays. Of course, they would reevaluate all of that once she could apparate on her own. Hermione had decided to make something of a statement with her return to Hogwarts, and her clothes were a big part of that. Over her regular underwear, she pulled a carbon nanofiber vest and bike shorts that George had enchanted for her. They were thinner than her jacket lining, and they weren't bulletproof, but they were slash-proof, and while they were heavier than a cotton vest and shorts, the fabric was so fine and they were so good at drawing away heat and moisture that they almost felt like they weren't even there. Over these went a skirt, shirt, cardigan, stockings, and outer robe that were of similar design to the Hogwarts uniform, but were of higher quality from Twilfit and Tattings. She had also asked to have them made with bright purple trim rather than any of the house colors, since purple was the traditional color of magic, especially light magic. In other words, she'd still look like a student, but a wealthy one, and one who took pride in her status as a witch, independent of house rivalries. For extra protection, she added a bulletproof lining to her outer robe. She'd wanted to make nanofiber stockings too, but the trouble with carbon nanotubes was that they had very little give, at reasonable forces, so they weren't a very suitable material. Mr. Weasley picked her up from home. She'd considered changing her Monday-Wednesday schedule at Grimmauld Place to further reduce the inconvenience, but she decided against it because a 5-day work week was less grueling. They apparated straight to the gates of Hogwarts. Not a typical apparition spot, but it was accessible and close to the safety of the wards, so it was an ideal spot. It honestly wasn't that hard in the magical world to make it so an enemy couldn't track your movements when you were out and about. The castle had changed too this year. The aura that emanated from its walls felt not darker exactly, but harsher, pricklier. The castle gates were chained shut, and everything somehow looked a tiny bit more shadowed. Hermione saw the chains and guessed that an Alohomora wouldn't work on those. "Thank you for bringing me, Mr. Weasley," she said. "But how do I get in?" "We're just about on time. They should know you're coming. Ah, there's someone now." Sure enough, a robed figure moved towards the gates, holding a wand in her left hand. Her right hand was a mechanical one similar to Cedric's. "Oh, it's you," Hestia Jones said flatly when she reached them. "Aura Jones, I didn't know you were here this year," Hermione replied. "It's XR now," she said resignedly, holding up her wooden hand. "I'm the new defense professor." "Oh, that's..." She trailed off. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to say. The position was cursed, after all. But what other prospects did an Auror have without her wand hand? "So this is the famous Hermione Granger," Aura Jones said. "I hear you nearly killed Bellatrix Lestrange." "Yes," she groaned, "but it wasn't with dark magic, if that's what you heard, and she tried to kill me first." "I don't care so much about how you did it. The woman is a menace, and Mad Eye even said, 'Good for her,' when he found out, even though she lived." "I suppose he thinks I wasn't paranoid enough." "He did mention that, too." "I didn't think wizards knew how to restart a heart," Hermione defended herself. "It involves electricity." Not all of us are completely ignorant, Jones said indignantly. Anyway, I wanted to ask you while you're here. I held some mock duels in my classes, and some of my students were using spells I'd never seen before, and they mentioned your name. There was one that looks like an incendio, but it blows up in your opponent's face and disorients them. Yes, Extonio, the flashbang hex, she said. That's one of mine. You invented it? Jones said with interest. Uh-huh, and taught it to the DA. I assume you've heard. That you and Potter led an illegal defense club for half a year? Yeah, and it sounds like they learnt more from you than they did from class. Not that that's saying much, so good on you, I guess. Thanks, Aura Jones, Hermione said uneasily. It sounded like she didn't appreciate her and Harry moving in on her turf. But the DA was over now. It shouldn't matter. In any case, Jones wasn't very talkative the rest of the way up to the castle. She just escorted Hermione to the alchemy classroom and left her there. As soon as she walked in, the rest of the class took notice. Probably the robes. Maybe. Alchemy was the smallest class in Hogwarts. The 6th and 7th years were grouped in the class together, and there were still only 10 of them. And even more unusually, they sat at 5 lab benches arranged in a circle. From Hermione's year were Daphne Greengrass, Anthony Goldstein, Terry Boot, and Sue Lee, and there were 5 7th years, although Cho Chang was the only one she knew personally. From what she'd heard, this was typical. Professor Dumbledore appeared, seemingly from thin air, in his midnight blue robes with gold stars, and he sat at a desk that was part of the circle, almost as an equal. "Welcome," he said, "and to the 7th years, welcome back. It is good to see young people continuing to take an interest in the subtle and extraordinarily complex science of alchemy. Now, to get the housekeeping out of the way, so to speak, alchemy is unique among the classes at Hogwarts in that it combines multiple years with a 2-year curriculum. To accomplish this, the first month or so of the class each year covers the basic principles of alchemy, and then we will study a slate of topics in the field of alchemy, which will rotate every other year. For the 7th years, this first month will therefore be mostly a review, but this review is especially important to this class. Alchemy is even more dangerous than transfiguration if it goes wrong, as dangerous as the most volatile of potions, so safety is of the utmost importance here. Just like Muggle chemistry, Hermione thought. Also, because this class is so small, it will run more like a seminar, he continued. So don't be afraid to speak up if you have a question or even just a pertinent comment without being called upon. Well, this would certainly be different, although it was logical with only 10 students. Alchemy is a varied field of study, lying at the intersection of transfiguration, potions, and ritual. This year's topics will revolve around the elements and their transmutation. This branch, elemental alchemy, is the part of alchemy that leans towards transfiguration, or, he looked at Hermione, to Muggle chemistry. Indeed, we will be studying the fundamental principles underlying the field of transfiguration this year, among other things. Students who were here the last year will be able to tell you about our studies of spagyric, plant alchemy. This branch of alchemy leans more towards potions. After all, what is potions, if not a transmutation process of seemingly random ingredients into liquids with magical effects? Thus, we studied the underlying principles of potion making last year, amid other topics such as what is sometimes called dry potion crafting, producing medicines from the ashes or other byproducts of plants without a liquid base, and a few showy parlor tricks such as restoring dead flowers to life. Hermione was taking copious notes. Alchemy was a broader field than she'd realized. In fact, she could think of an apt analogy. It seemed alchemy was to transfiguration, and potions, interestingly, as analysis was to calculus. Maybe there was a reason Professor Slughorn was so good at both fields. "Professor, I thought there was no magic that could reverse death," Terry Boot said. "Correct, Mr. Boot," Dumbledore replied with a slight smile. "However, death means something very different to plants than it does to us. Plants die bit by bit, not all at once. It can take days, weeks, or in the case of the longest-lived trees, even centuries for them to die. Consider this. Fruits and vegetables that are eaten fresh, that is, they have not been cooked, dried, or frozen, are still alive when they are eaten. Their cells are still absorbing light and moisture and surviving off their stored sugars." The sixth years looked at each other in surprise. Hermione hadn't known that, and it appeared the others hadn't either. Her animal rights sensibilities twitched, but she quickly quashed that. Vegetables didn't have nervous systems. "So you see," Dumbledore continued, "even a wilted flower is usually only mostly dead, and thus can be revived, at least with a success rate sufficient to wow a Muggle audience, as the Count of St. Germain once did. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To begin our review, and to introduce our newcomers to the field, can you tell me what alchemy properly is? Mr. Belby." Belby, one of the seventh-year Ravenclaws, nodded and answered, "Alchemy as a modern field of study is just transformation magic, but in its most general sense. Like how transfiguration is limited by Gamp's law, but a big part of alchemy is the study of how it's possible to get around Gamp's law in some cases." "Correct. Alchemy is a somewhat eclectic field. This is largely due to the work of Pericles, who laid down many of the foundations before the distinctions between its various branches were understood. We reconcile this today by defining alchemy as the study of transformations that cannot be accomplished with lesser magics such as transfiguration and potions, including, yes, those that would violate Gamp's law. As I said, this year we will focus on elemental alchemy, which, as its name implies, is the science of manipulating and transmuting the elements," Dumbledore said. He rose and backed up to the chalkboard, writing the word "elements" on it. "So we must naturally begin with the question of, what is an element? Miss Granger, perhaps you could tell us?" Hermione wasn't going to field that one, since she suspected her definition wasn't the magical one. But since he asked her directly, she suspected that was actually what he was fishing for. "Well, there are a number of historical definitions," she said, "but an element is considered to be one of the fundamental substances that compose all matter, which cannot be broken down further by chemical means." "Which is, essentially, the historical definition as well," Dumbledore agreed. "But I believe Miss Granger is referring specifically to the chemical elements." He wrote "chemical elements" underneath the first line. "These are the substances which are composed of identical atoms, which for our purposes are indivisible. Oxygen and hydrogen are chemical elements, for example, which together form the classical element of water. Miss Granger, how many chemical elements are there?" I haven't kept pace with the latest discoveries, Professor, but I know there are—" She stopped and considered her wording. "Stable elements? Natural elements? Long-lived elements?" "Well, there are 83 that occur in nature in significant quantities. Muggles have created about half a dozen others with actual useful applications, and a few more that are too unstable to use." "Muggles create elements?" Daphne Greengrass said in disbelief. "Indeed, Miss Greengrass," Dumbledore replied cheerfully. "Miss Granger's recent papers on Gamp's Law dealt with that very topic. But since we are interested here in natural primordial elements, those occurring from the formation of the earth, the number we want is 84. 84? Hermione said. "What did I miss?" "The 84th is plutonium. The details are complicated, but it was discovered in the 1970s that primordial plutonium occurs in uranium ores at the rate of 1 part in a billion billion. The amount is minuscule, but it is important because it completes an arithmetic matrix, 7 times 12 primordial elements." Hermione made a note to look that up in her nuclear physics book. "Of course, alchemy is not well known for the study of chemical elements, even though much of the new work of the past 200 years has centered around them. This is mainly because the chemical elements were not clearly recognized as such until the Muggle chemist Leviosa did so in 1789, which revolutionized the field. Yes, a Muggle, and yes, that long after the discovery of the Philosopher's Stone," he added, at most of the class's surprised look. "You may have wondered, if Nicholas Flamel synthesized the Philosopher's Stone in the 14th century, what contributions I and other alchemists could have made in the 20th. This is a large part of that. In any case, the field is far better known for its study of the classical elements. Most ancient alchemists meant the same thing by the word element that we still do today, a fundamental substance that cannot be broken down further. Today, we understand that this is not literally true, but the classical elements do, in several important ways, represent fundamental magical roots, which we will study in the coming weeks. Now, how many classical elements are there? There were mixed replies of 4 and 5, causing confusion in the class. Dumbledore gave a wry smile and answered, "In fact, there are 5. He wrote them on the board in the traditional diamond diagram. Water, earth, fire, air, or wind, and ether." Anthony Goldstein said. "Correct." He wrote the word in the middle of the diagram. "But the ether doesn't exist, Professor," Hermione said. He raised an eyebrow at her. "Doesn't it?" "No. Aristotle said ether was the substance the heavens were made of, but they're actually the same elements we have here on Earth." Dumbledore nodded subtly. "That is correct after a fashion, Miss Granger. Aristotle erred in thinking that the heavens were made of a different physical substance than the earth. But the Greek aether literally means that which fills the heavens, and in this respect Aristotle's usage is entirely consistent with the alchemists of India, Japan, and many other cultures, who gave the fifth element names that translate as—" He waved his hand, and the chalk letters reformed themselves on the board. "Void." "Oh, of course, void," she thought. If alchemy could be described by group theory as she knew the chemical elements could, then it would have to have a null element, the vacuum. Dumbledore went on to explain how nearly all alchemical traditions recognized these 5 elements, with 2 notable exceptions. One was Chinese alchemy, which was based on completely different foundations of competing energies, and the other was Paracelsus. Paracelsus recognized 3 fundamental elements: sulfur, mercury, and salt, while he regarded the classical 5 as merely qualities of substances. That was oddly nearer to the truth in Hermione's mind. The classical elements clearly represented states of matter, not true elements: solid, liquid, gas, plasma, and vacuum, as Dumbledore pointed out as well. For all his eccentricities, Paracelsus was a lot nearer to Muggle chemistry than those who came before him. Hermione was pleased to find that Dumbledore was an even better teacher at alchemy than he was at occlumency. The discussion was fascinating, being in a class of mostly Ravenclaws helped, and it was with reluctance that he had to cut it short when it was time to go to dinner. "One of the downsides of a late afternoon class," he told them. "You are not required to be at the Great Hall on time, but I am. I wouldn't want Professor McGonagall to take away points from me." They laughed as they packed up their things, and Hermione joined the rest of the students for dinner. She was eager to see Harry, Ginny, and Ron again, and make sure they were staying out of trouble. She reached the entrance hall just as Hagrid was coming in. "Hermione, good to see you," he said jovially. "You too, Hagrid," she said. "This year's starting a bit better than last year, I hope?"
"Lots. Well, it's got a lot darker outside the school, but at least no one's making trouble in here. How are you? You doing all right?"
"Oh, it's been difficult with my parents, but other than that, things are going okay."
"That's good to hear. I know I've been seeing lots of the twins' pranks around the castle, so I know they're doing well. I'm guessing you're doing a part-time program here?"
"Yes, just alchemy and arithmancy. I'm sticking with private tutoring for the rest so I can still go home at night."
"Well, I hope it works out for you. Say, stop by me hut sometime if you can. I want you to be meeting me brother."
"The brother who's a 16-foot-tall giant who can rip fully grown trees from the ground?" she thought. I can't do a whole lot until I turn 17 and pass my apparition test, Hagrid. And even then, my parents won't want me wandering too much, but I'll see what I can do."
"Thanks, Hermione. You know, I wanted to ask you and Harry to keep an eye on him if I got sacked, but you were both gone, so I just had to take him with me when the R's chased us out. But of course, we were back by morning thanks to Dumbledore."
"Well, I'm glad that worked out for you, Hagrid." She waved goodbye and took a seat at the Gryffindor table near Harry, Ginny, and Ron. Seamus Finnegan was back, she noticed, though he was a ways down the table and not talking to anyone. The pimples spelling "sneak" across his face were gone, although he had some visible scarring. Seamus had actually sent Hermione a letter apologizing profusely for betraying the D.A. and claiming he never would have done it if he'd known you-know-who was back earlier in the summer. Hermione wasn't in a very forgiving mood, even though she'd sort of forced Seamus to join. Almost everyone else in the D.A. had believed Harry. There was no reason for Seamus not to. And if he hadn't got Harry expelled, maybe the incident at the Department of Mysteries and Lee's death could have been avoided. She didn't have any interest in talking to Seamus, though. She wanted to focus on her friends while she was here.
"Hi, Hermione, how's it going?"
Ginny asked.
"Pretty well. Alchemy is fascinating. I'm glad I stayed for it. George and Fred say hello, by the way. Apparently sales are dropping off with everyone back in school, but the shop's still doing all right."
"That's good," Ron said. "So, purple robes, is that some secret house of Merlin or something?" Hermione rolled her eyes.
"No, Ron, I just thought it would be a good look for visiting the school. I wasn't sure I could still wear Gryffindor robes, but I still wanted to look like a student."
"It looks good on you," Ginny said.
"Thanks, Ginny. So, Harry, how did Professor Snape feel about you joining his potions class?"
"He was as big a git as ever," Harry said. "He tried to give me a detention and throw me out of the classroom to start with, and I think he almost had a heart attack when I showed him my owl marks. He even checked with McGonagall to make sure they were right."
"Wow."
"Yeah. Oh, Hermione, look there," he whispered. She turned and looked where he was pointing.
"At Malfoy?"
"Yeah, look." Draco Malfoy was swaggering down the Slytherin table to his seat, his robes billowing behind him, looking far more confident than he had last spring when his father had gone to Azkaban.
"Well, he looks cocky this year," Hermione commented.
"Yeah, but look at his robes."
"His robes? Well, they're—"
Her voice trailed off as she made the connection.
"They're billowing around like Snape's,"
Ron said helpfully.
"That is a little odd," she admitted.
"And that's not all," Harry said. "I was watching him in potions class, and I don't think he's using the same book as everyone else."
"He's not?"
"No, he wasn't doing the same steps as the rest of us, but his potion turned out perfect."
"Oh, well, that's not that strange," Hermione said. "Professor Slughorn said you have to adjust the recipe as you go, like in cooking, remember? Maybe Malfoy's better than we thought at potions."
"I don't think so. I got a good look at his book. It was old, and all marked up."
"So?"
"So, since when does Malfoy ever use anything other than the best?" Harry demanded. "And on the Hogwarts Express, I overheard him talking about how things were different now, that it wasn't about getting good marks anymore. And there's still what he was doing in Knockturn Alley."
"Okay, but what does all that mean?"
she asked. Harry lowered his voice even further. "I think Voldemort gave Malfoy some kind of assignment, and Snape's helping him."
"But Snape's on our side,"
she replied automatically.
"So everyone says, but how do we know it's true?"
"I don't buy it, mate," Ron said. "You know who giving Malfoy an assignment?" "Why not?" asked Harry. "Dumbledore's given Hermione and me assignments." Hermione was about to say that that was different, that their assignments were purely academic, but she couldn't really say that now that they were looking for Horcruxes.
"I suppose it's possible," she admitted. "But really, what assignment could Malfoy do in here besides annoying you? Snape's probably just feeding him spells and potions tips to make himself look better to the other Death Eaters."
"I don't think so," Harry said. "I think there's something more to it. I'm going to keep an eye on him."
"Well, you can if you want, just don't get in trouble," she replied.
"Not making any promises, Hermione." Ginny whacked him in the arm.
"Don't worry, Hermione," she said. "I'll keep him in line."
Between her Hogwarts days, Hermione's lessons at Grimmauld Place were as intense as ever. Nonverbal spellcasting was the norm at the Newt level, not to mention the fact that she was pushing herself extra hard in defense. However, she still found Transfiguration to be the most interesting of the subjects she was studying there, and she had to admit Professor Slughorn was nearly as good at it as Professor McGonagall was. "Now that we've covered the basic knowledge you'll need to begin your alchemy classes," Slughorn said, "let's start in on one of the most important topics of Newt-level Transfiguration. Conjuring.
Conjuring, or conjuration, is the art of making objects appear from nothing. Different authorities have different ways of describing this, but you might appreciate the alchemical explanation. That conjuration is the art of transfiguring objects from the element of void. Naturally, this is more difficult than standard transfiguration, and is subject to different restrictions, but it's a good guideline for the spells. Now, if Minerva is still doing her job, you will have had the rule drilled into you: some transfiguration is permanent, and some is not. On the other hand, conjuration is never permanent.
Right, Hermione said. Professor McGonagall explained the basics when we covered vanishing. But I was wondering something about that. What about the augmenti charm? Isn't that a permanent conjuration?
Oh, clever girl. Not quite, Miss Granger. It does look like one, since it creates water from nothing, but as Professor Dumbledore will probably tell you soon, augmenti is actually an alchemical charm. If you looked at the arithmancy, you would find that it is different from conjuration. Alchemy makes little use of actual spells, but each element has its own class of permanent conjuration charms. Incendio is the trivial case for fire. Even a first year can cast it. Evanesco, Augmenti, and Ventus are examples of more advanced charms for the elements of void, water, and air, respectively. The Bubblehead charm is also in this category. The remaining element, Earth Conjuration, requires a mastery-level charm, and it can only conjure earth in its purest form.
Stone? She asked. Dirt isn't pure, and most metals aren't as long-lasting, so I think it would have to be.
Yes, but not just stone. Quartz.
Wizards can conjure quartz? She said in surprise. She thought she had a monopoly on making gemstones.
Only with great difficulty, and the only real call for it is to make powerful runestones.
Hermione's eyes widened. Of course, the anchor stones of Hogwarts. That's how the founders built a pure quartz stone circle instead of just using granite.
Yes, or at least I suspect that's what they did. But now, to basic conjuring. It is never permanent. Any conjured object is a construct that will vanish after a time if left on its own. You've dealt with this before, with non-permanent transfiguration, but it's time to examine the subject in more detail. Observe. I can conjure up an animal, say a squirrel.
He waved his wand, and a red squirrel appeared on the dining room table.
And it will behave like a real squirrel to the best of my knowledge. But in truth it is only a construct. As I am not an expert on the subject of squirrels, you would soon see it behaving in unsquirrel-like ways, and repeating its actions like a magical photograph. It has no need to eat or sleep, although I can enchant it to do so. But I can also enchant it to do other things, like dance a waltz, far easier than doing it with a true animal.
He waved his wand again, and the squirrel stood up on its hind legs and began twirling around the table. Hermione giggled.
One thing you probably haven't done in class before is to modify conjured objects, another subject we will be touching on, albeit not as deeply. Suppose I wanted to make a purple and green squirrel.
With another wave of his wand, a second squirrel appeared, this one with bright purple fur and green underneath. It began dancing with the first squirrel.
That is not very difficult, but remember, transfiguration is the magic of the familiar. The more you change the pattern from a normal squirrel to any other animal, the more difficult it is. Conjuring a six-legged squirrel, for example, would require you to think very carefully about how the skeleton should be arranged, which thus requires an advanced knowledge of anatomy, a lot of messy experimentation, or both.
Hermione cocked her head and tried to make sense of this. Why would you want to conjure a six-legged squirrel? But then again, why would you want to turn beetles into buttons either? It was times like this when the whole field of transfiguration seemed like a solution in search of a problem.
So, what's the point of that, Professor?
Well, there's not exactly a point to that in particular. A six-legged squirrel is little beyond my expertise, to be honest. But we'll be doing some simpler exercises to help you improve your conjuring skills. A rabbit with a duck bill is a classic example, which is about as difficult as we'll be dealing with. It takes a true artist to conjure a purely imaginary creature from whole cloth, so to speak.
Okay, but why now? Why not do this with the transfigured animals we've been working with for years?
For two reasons, Miss Granger. One, the complexity of the spell involved, and two, it's actually easier to conjure an animal with an unnatural form than it is to transfigure one, for a construct has no reality of its own, while a living animal has a resistance to such drastic magic. And we may be thankful for that, else human transfiguration would be far too dangerous to entrust to any but professionals."
"No reality of its own?" she said in confusion.
"Well, they are conjured from nothing, aren't they?" He motioned to the squirrels again. "They have no existence, no physical properties at all other than that which we give them."
"No physical properties?" Her eyebrows rose as she made the connection. "Then could you conjure a weightless squirrel, Professor?"
"Weightless?"
"Unaffected by gravity."
"I know what it means, Miss Granger. It's a bit tricky, but maybe—" He concentrated and waved his wand several times. Slowly a floating squirrel began to appear. It flailed randomly and began attempting to swim through the air as she watched. "Ah, there we go. But what is the significance of that, Miss Granger?"
"Conservation of mass, sir. If it has no existence, then it has no mass. It solves the energy problem of magic, or at least a big part of it."
That might have been the thing that had most confounded Hermione about magic when she first entered the magical world. It didn't obey conservation of energy. She thought conjuring mass was the worst offender, but maybe conjuring didn't create mass at all. Perhaps it was pure magic wrapped up in a form that behaved as if it had mass because the caster wanted, no, expected it to, but could equally well go without. A sort of magical hologram like on Star Trek. Perhaps that was all any magic that seemed to violate conservation of energy did. But no, she remembered their conversation earlier. There were some permanent conjurations. Or did even Aguamenti balance the books somewhere? No, this was Department of Mysteries stuff, she decided. It would take a lifetime of study to tease out those possibilities. Best to just focus on her lessons. For now. Since Hermione was an official guest now, rather than an unofficial one, and since the Room of Requirement was now public knowledge, she was housed in the official guest quarters at Hogwarts when she stayed overnight on Friday. A small unused apartment near Gryffindor Tower had been newly furnished by the house elves for her use, and it was very pleasant being able to sleep in the old castle again. On Saturday morning she was to go in for her first lesson with Dumbledore regarding Horcruxes. Here she really had no idea what to expect, except that she would be studying the vilest of dark rituals to try to find a way to reverse it. Dumbledore would really have rather not spread such knowledge around, but it was the only way to save Harry, and she would leave no stone unturned, whether he wanted to or not. But Dumbledore didn't begin by talking about Horcruxes. Instead, he asked her about her own studies.
"I think it would be best if you explained the elements of the mathematics you have been studying for this project, Hermione," he said. "I understand you do not have time to explain everything to me, especially as you are now beyond even Septima's level, but I had hoped you could explain the basics so that I could perhaps guide you in the most promising lines of research, and to warn you against dangerous pitfalls. We are, after all, attempting to delve into the deepest mysteries of magic, and that is never safe. I must remind you at the outset of Adelbert Waffling's first fundamental law of magic. Tamper with the deepest mysteries, the source of life, the essence of self, only if prepared for consequences of the most extreme and dangerous kind." "Oh," Hermione said with a shiver as the weight of what they were doing was impressed upon her. Of course, Professor, I understand. I suppose I can explain the basics to you. I've been studying two specific related fields of maths this summer. Algebraic topology and differential geometry. Both of these are in a sense the mathematics of shapes, not geometry, not as you would know it, sir, but in a far broader sense. Differential geometry is probably the more intuitive one. It uses calculus to study geometry on manifolds rather than just the plane. Manifolds are, well, it's complicated in the details, but they're basically mathematical constructs that look like Euclidean geometry at small scales, but may behave very differently at large scales. They can bend through extra dimensions. They can allow for imaginary distances or complex coordinates. You can't exactly think of them as normal spaces or surfaces. They're studied as intrinsic mathematical objects, not something you could see or visualize, but you can still do geometry on them. It's the mathematics that describes gravity and the structure of the universe, for example." "Is it really?" Dumbledore asked. "I was under the impression that ordinary algebra and calculus did that." "For Newton's theory of gravity it does, but Einstein showed that's only a special case. Under extreme conditions you need much more complex maths to describe it." "Fascinating. And the other subject?" "Algebraic topology. It's a little difficult to describe. I suppose you could say it's the study of different kinds of manifolds and what they have in common. It's done with group theory, which sort of maps manifolds to other mathematical structures. But the reason I chose it is because I thought there was an important analogy to soul magic. You see, splitting a manifold, separating an arbitrary shape into two disjoint ones, is breaking the rules of topology. So it's kind of like how a Horcrux breaks the normal rules of magic, and I thought it could be useful to understand the ritual." "Very curious. That does sound eerily similar to our problem, especially compared with most of the arithmancy that I know, which is not abstract enough to plumb the nature of the soul. How does this categorizing of shapes work, and why is it important?"
Hermione soon found herself giving a crash course in the field and several related topics. She told Dumbledore about the deformations used in topology, and which shapes, or which characteristics of shapes, she clarified when asked, were invariant under them. That one of the most important characteristics was the number of holes in a shape. How those characteristics were formally defined in terms of points and sets. How the deformations could be used to analyze complex shapes. A donut was the same topological shape as a teacup, she explained, but not a teapot, while even the seemingly intractable hole in a hole in a hole was merely a highly distorted three-hole donut. Dumbledore was especially interested when she explained that the human body was the same topological shape as a torus. Well, technically the nose and ears complicated that, but it wasn't an exact science when it came to magic. And he pursued that line of thought further. She explained that a torus was topologically a square with opposite pairs of edges glued together. Of course, it took some effort to convince Dumbledore that the torus was actually a flat surface and not a curved one, and that drawing it as a square didn't make it topologically not a torus as long as you were clear about how the edges were connected. This, she said, was because the torus was in some ways a four-dimensional object, the familiar donut shape being an embedding into three-dimensional space. Although you could perform differential geometry equally on the flat and embedded tori. Algebraically, it also represented the quotient group of the plane divided by the lattice of integer coordinates, putting it on a firmer mathematical foundation. And then she went into how, if you glued the edges of a square together in different directions, you could get other shapes. The sphere, the projective plane, and the Klein bottle. The same way you could get either a ring or a Mobius strip by gluing just two of the edges together in different directions. Despite the complexity of the material, she found that Dumbledore was as attentive a student as Septima. Student? She thought. Well, it did seem appropriate in this context. He caught on quickly. He asked insightful questions, and he pushed her when necessary to explain it to someone who hadn't had the requisite training, which wasn't easy at times. She tended to forget what the average dabbler in arithmancy did and didn't know. "We seem to be doing a lot of cutting and pasting if it violates the rules of topology," he commented at one point. Hermione blushed a little. She hadn't thought of it like that before. "I suppose so, Professor," she said. "But these are just explanations of how you can construct them. Proper topology treats the manifolds as if they simply are. Or instead, you can think of it that you're not cutting and pasting at all. The square can still be in the plane, except you have boundary conditions where if a point moves off one edge, it magically comes back in from the opposite edge." "Ah, I think I see your point. I've heard curse breakers talk of magical traps that functioned that way. And from what you said about not needing an external space for it to exist in, there would be no real difference, would there?" "Exactly. Topologically, they're the same shape." "Nonetheless, I think your cutting and pasting analogy may be correct for the Horcrux ritual.
I cannot be certain, but it has a ring of truth to it. Pardon the pun. After all, to actually make these marvelous shapes out of physical, or spiritual, substance, would require cutting and pasting, although I should hope it would never reach the degree you describe when it comes to souls." "Me neither, but that's good to hear, sir."
Maybe there was hope for this after all. Suddenly Dumbledore looked at a strange contraption of a clock with a start.
"Oh my," he said. "Look at the time. It's nearly lunch. I suppose we'll have to continue this discussion another time."
Hermione started in surprise. She'd completely lost track of time. They weren't going to talk about Horcruxes? Had Dumbledore just delayed the whole morning so they wouldn't get into them?
"We are actually going to look at the Horcrux ritual, aren't we, Professor?" she asked worriedly. "Yes, we will, Hermione. But it was important for me to get my bearings with regard to your arithmancy first, for both of our safety's sake. We will delve into the dark magic at a later date." "Oh, of course." "I want to thank you, Hermione. It is not often that a man of my age has an opportunity to learn such wonderful new things." You're welcome, Professor," she said, blushing. "I guess I'll see you again next weekend. Oh dear." Her face fell. "What is it?" "I just realized I'm going to have to explain all of this all over again to Septima after lunch."
In Muggle Britain, teens could apply for a provisional driving license at age 16 3/4, but they were not allowed to start driving lessons until they were 17. That was one more reason Hermione was glad she was a witch. While her Muggle friends from primary school were, if they were lucky, going in for their first lesson on their 17th birthday, Hermione was going in for her full apparition license. The test proctor was not her instructor, Mr. Twycross, but a witch in the department named Brewster, who seemed as disinterested in the whole thing as Twycross was enthusiastic.
"You should know the apparition point behind the leaky cauldron,"
Miss Brewster said.
"We'll be apparating there. Land on the spot without splinching yourself in one try, without taking excessive time, and you'll pass. If you can't do it, you have to wait at least 1 week before trying again. I'll be going alongside you to check to make sure you got it. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Then apparate on 3. 1, 2, 3." Hermione concentrated on the spot and spun through the 4th dimension to land lightly on her feet behind the leaky cauldron. Miss Brewster landed by her side with a pop. She scrutinized Hermione very carefully, searching for any reason to fail her. When nothing visibly looked out of place, she waved her wand over her to be sure. "Congratulations, Miss Granger, you've passed," she said, sounding a little unhappy about it. "Come back to my office and I'll give you your license." And she vanished again before Hermione could thank her. Hermione's eyes narrowed as she watched the spot where Miss Brewster had been. Idly, she wondered if anyone ever failed the test because they botched the return trip, or if they took the night bus back to the ministry just to annoy their proctor. But she successfully apparated back to the atrium without any trouble, and a few minutes later she walked back out to her parents' car with her new license in hand. At least that was her transportation problem solved.